My mother was the very definition of a narcissist, a trait she didn't quite just acquire overnight, but had honed to perfection over the years. For as long as I could remember, her selfishness and toxic behavior were constants in my life. Whether it was the sports I played, the way I dressed, or the way my body looked, she was always there to remind me with biting remarks that I wasn't good enough. Looking back, I realized how warped my understanding of love had become under her influence. I believe that her constant criticisms and put-downs were her way of showing she cared, a twisted expression of love that I would eventually discover was anything but. At 16, I met a boy who would later become my ex-husband. He was a year younger, but we were in the same grade, and what started as an innocent friendship quickly blossomed into something more. My mother hated him with a passion that, at the time, I couldn't fully comprehend. She gave me hell for dating him, constantly telling me he wasn't good enough, that he was a loser with no future. She didn't want me anywhere near him, and I couldn't understand why she was so vehemently against our relationship. But now, in hindsight, it all makes sense. He was, in many ways, a reflection of my mother, another narcissist. He came from a rough background. His father was in prison, and his mother had lost legal custody of him due to her struggles with drugs. He played the role of the poor stray kid perfectly, and I fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. I begged my parents to let him stay with us because, according to him, he had nowhere else to go. My father was hesitant, but my mother, strangely enough, was the one who pleaded his case the hardest. Reluctantly, my father agreed and my ex moved in. At first, things were okay. It was almost nice, like we were all playing house together. But then the cracks began to show. Whenever my ex would go out with friends, my mother's anger would flare up. She would come to me with venom in her voice, saying things like, "How can you let him walk all over you? And he's probably cheating on you right now." I was baffled by her behavior. Why did she feel the need to insert herself so deeply into my relationship? When I confronted her about it, she would brush it off, assuring me it was just her being a protective mother, that she had my best interests at heart. But to be honest, it felt more like she was a jealous girlfriend than a concerned mother. My ex hated my mother with a passion. He couldn't stand how obsessed she was with him, how she would insert herself into every aspect of her relationship. He called her crazy, said terrible things about her, and yet, despite my growing doubts, I defended her. "She's my mom," I'd say, parroting the very words she'd fed me. "She just wants what's best for me." But the truth was, I was incredibly naive, and as the years went on, the situation only worsened. After we graduated high school, nothing changed. If anything, I just became more numb to it all. By then, I had been with him for 3 years, and my family was pressuring me to get married. They didn't like the fact that I was living with him out of wedlock, and my mother, despite all her previous animosity, was the one who pushed the hardest. She denies it now, of course, but back then, she was relentless. I always knew I never wanted to get married, but against my better judgment, I did it anyway. I married him, and for a brief, shining moment, all seemed well. My mother and my ex were finally getting along, and I naively thought this was a good thing. I believed their newfound friendship would finally give me some peace, no longer having to play the role of mediator between their constant bickering. But little by little, things started to change. My ex began insisting that I invite my mother to everything we did. And like the fool I was, I obliged. My mother would guilt-trip me, claiming she was lonely because her relationship with my father was deteriorating. It was yet another red flag that I chose to ignore. Over time, I began to feel like a third wheel in my own marriage, a mere spectator to the bizarre relationship forming between my husband and my mother. Meanwhile, my parents' marriage was crumbling before my eyes, and though I sensed something was deeply wrong, every time I confronted my mother, she would gaslight me, calling me crazy for even suggesting that something was amiss. It got to the point where I stopped talking altogether, retreating into myself, a silent observer to the chaos that was unfolding around me. My father eventually came to me confiding that he believed my mother was being unfaithful. He told me it wasn't the first time she had cheated on him and that all the same warning signs were there. I felt a sickening pit in my stomach because I was experiencing the exact same things in my own marriage. I knew something was wrong when just 8 months into our marriage, my ex wanted nothing to do with me. I knew it wasn't right that my 44-year-old mother was getting birth control while she and my father were in the midst of a divorce. But I was paralyzed by fear, terrified to confront them and risk being right. So I let it go on for months, silently enduring as they treated me like the dumb, ignorant wife, while they played house behind my back. I watched as my father's spirit slowly withered away, as my mother convinced everyone that he was crazy for thinking she was in a relationship with her own son-in-law. And despite knowing the truth deep down, I was so desperate, so terrified of being right, that I allowed her to convince me otherwise. She even went so far as to urge my sister and me to cut contact with our father, claiming he was obsessed with her and spreading lies. And like the good, obedient daughter I had always been, I let her manipulate me, despite the nagging voice in my head screaming that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, I could no longer live in denial. I told my ex that I wanted a divorce because I no longer loved him, and I knew he didn't love me either. He tried to feed me some BS about how we were just in different places in our lives, but I saw right through it. Despite our separation, my mother insisted that he stay in our home, saying he had nobody else. Yet she had no problem kicking my father out, leaving him practically homeless. Things came to a head when my sister and father moved out, and my ex was relegated to sleeping on the couch in the living room. One night, I got up to get some water and found my mother in the living room, her face a mask of guilt and fear as she had just been caught red-handed. I asked her what she was doing up in the middle of the night, and she gave me the most ridiculous excuse, claiming she had gotten thirsty and had hidden to scare me when she heard me coming out of my room. I stared at her in disbelief, knowing she was lying through her teeth, while my ex pretended to be asleep on the couch as if he couldn't hear us talking right there. Not even 2 nights later, I caught my ex running down the hallway from the direction of my mother's room. When I confronted him, he gave me another laughably obvious lie, claiming he was just using the bathroom. At that moment, everything came crashing down around me. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, what was going on, but I was still too scared to leave, too terrified of being right and losing not just my husband, but my mother, the one person I had always believed I could trust. Eventually, I did leave. I confronted both my mother and my ex, and they, of course, denied everything. Even my grandmother confronted my mother, asking her how she could do such a thing to her own daughter. But my mother, in her typical narcissistic fashion, replied that he was like a son to her, that she couldn't just kick him out because he had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, she had no problem watching me leave with nothing to my name, moving out on my own. For months, I lived in a state of limbo, divorced and alone, while my ex continued to live with my mother, still playing the role of the dutiful son-in-law. But my breaking point came when my grandmother died. She had always been the one constant in my life, the one person who showed me what real unconditional love was supposed to look like. When she passed, the loss hit me harder than I ever imagined. My mother, of course, made a brief appearance while my grandmother was in the hospital, but left the moment she passed. When I asked her if she would be at the memorial, she coldly replied that it wouldn't help her grief to be there. Little did I know that instead of being at her own mother's memorial, she was off playing boyfriend and girlfriend with my ex at a casino. It was then that I finally confronted her, demanding the truth. And to my surprise, she admitted it. She confessed that she and my ex were now in a relationship, but refused to tell me when it began, wouldn't even acknowledge the lies she had told her own mother before her death. I asked her how she could do something so awful to her firstborn daughter, to her baby girl, and she simply replied that she was lonely and that she was only human. The worst part of it all was that even after her confession, I gave her another chance. I told her to choose me, that we could heal together if she just left him. But she chose him instead. And that was the end of it, a betrayal that had been simmering for longer than I ever realized. Living with a narcissist is something to you. It warps your sense of reality, convinces you that somehow all the awful things they do to you are your fault. Even after everything she put me through, I was still the bad guy. I was the one who left her alone. I was the one who drove her to make this terrible decision. But I've come to realize that I am not who she made me out to be. I am deserving of love, of real, unconditional love. This woman was blown away when she found footage from her home security camera, a live feed of her husband in bed with another woman. You won't want to miss out on what happened next. Check out this video to find out.